Welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I am your host, Casey Ruff, and I am extremely excited to introduce you to our guest today. Bob Seebohar is one of the first USA Triathlon Level 3 elite coaches in the country. He has personally coached Olympians, national champions, and competitive age groupers. Additionally, he is a USAT youth and junior certified coach, an NSCA certified strength and conditioning specialist, a swim speed secret coach, and a sport dietitian. He owns eNRG Performance in Littleton, Colorado, which provides nutrition, physiological testing, and coaching services to all individuals. I am so thrilled to have you on, if for nothing else to tell you personally that you have made a huge impact in my life, and anybody who has ever worked with me in the past 8 years has been directly influenced by your work. I've learned from a lot of other people since then, but I have to say, like, you made the biggest difference of anybody that I've ever listened to and changed my career for the rest of my life and influenced all the people that I've gotten to work with. And I mean that sincerely. I really appreciate you.
Wow. I mean, Casey, thank you, number one, for having me here. But number two, wow, is all I can say to that. I mean, that is the epitome of why I do what I do. I mean, truly is to influence others. So thank you for those very kind words.
Man, I was an endurance athlete. This is 2012, summer of 2012. I remember exactly where I was. We had a call with you because you were doing metabolic testing, which is something that we had been doing. And you presented this idea that it just blew me away, that you could affect people's metabolisms and what they burn while they're exercising through diet. And at the time, again, I was an endurance athlete, I was a road cyclist, and I was doing everything by the book. I remember, like, we had a PowerPoint presentation with my team that talked all about optimizing nutrition, how to make sure that you get, your whole grains and oatmeal and, your cereal in the mornings, and you have all your goos and your Cytomax and everything laid out, and here's how you time it, and here's how you avoid bonking. And you came on the phone and said that you were coaching elite level triathletes by feeding them fat. And I was like, what? Who is this guy? That is the weirdest thing I've ever heard. And you were saying that they could go out and race at top levels on very few calories every single hour and they would never bonk. That's mind-blowing. How did you come to that conclusion?
Well, first, I mean, it was kind of mind-blowing when I was going through this. So I developed the concept of metabolic efficiency training in the early 2000s. So 2003, 2004 is when I started. Actually, early. 2003. Yeah, 2003. I remember this really vividly. I flew out to Boston. It was there's a peer group that I belonged to, it being a sport dietitian, and they're having their annual meeting, and they asked me to come out and talk about nutrition periodization and metabolic efficiency training. That was the first ever public. That's kind of when this metabolic efficiency training concept kind of came out of the closet, if you will. Like, that was the first official presentation. Before I had really polished it, I was actually presenting to my colleagues about it. And it was so funny, Casey, because I remember standing up in front of the group, and I've done quite a few presentations, and I like reading the energy, and I like reading the body language of the group. And all the people in there were mostly dietitians, mostly what I call old school registered dietitians. They were sitting there, their jaws were at the floor. They're looking at me like I'm absolutely crazy, like out of my mind. Like, thank goodness. I think the only thing that saved me was that I actually was a registered dietitian. So they're like, okay, this guy's not a total quack, right? But I mean, to be honest with you, once I was classically trained in university. I've got 3 degrees in 1 undergrad, 2 graduate degrees, went through the same thing that all of us do. And unfortunately, I still hear it's kind of the same in university, but it's the food guide pyramid, it's the pushing carbs and like super high carb diet. And I went through that too, like in the mid 90s, not to date myself, but I just did. In the mid 90s, right? I'm starting endurance sports. Like, I came from a soccer background, kind of a competitive soccer background, and went into endurance sports. And the mantra, like you grew up with too, was eat as many carbs as possible so you don't bonk, right? You need energy. And like, for me, it was like tearing up my gut. And I was having GI distress, and I was having energy issues. In 99, I did my first Ironman, and I struggled through that, even though it was fun, but I struggled through it nutritionally. And I just, I remember I got back from that. It was, 99, then 2000. I'm like, this isn't right. So I started talking to people because I was new to like Ironman racing. So I started talking to more athletes and I'm like, is that normal? Like, should I have been throwing up? Should I, visit the porta potty every mile on the marathon? And they're like, yeah, that's it. Yeah, we do it. And, so I'm like, no, that's not right. So I guess it was just my frustration that kind of led to the whole metabolic efficiency training concept, and really the frustration of there has to be something either better out there, or more importantly, and this is actually the answer to this, more importantly, maybe we missed something in research, or maybe something hasn't been done yet. And that blossomed the whole metabolic efficiency training concept. It really, really did.
Wow. Let's deep dive into that concept. What is metabolic efficiency?
Yeah. So in brief, we store abundant, almost limitless amounts of fat as calories in our body, right? I mean, we're talking 80,000, 90,000 calories stored as fat, just an enormous amount. And unfortunately, we don't store that many carbohydrates. So depending on the gender and the size of the person, we can probably store roughly 1,200 to maybe 2,000 calories worth of carbohydrates. So we know this, like we learned this in exercise physiology 101, right? But what I was thinking when I kind of revisited this was I was thinking, man, if we have all those fat stores, is there an opportunity to actually use the like preserve our carbs until we really need them for more anaerobic metabolism or high-end outputs? But can we really teach our body to burn more fat? So basically, metabolic efficiency is teaching the body to be more efficient at using fat as energy and thus preserving carbohydrates, specifically muscle glycogen, until we really need it in activities or in sports or in competition. That's kind of the high-end definition of metabolic efficiency.
Why is it that we store so many more calories from fat than we do from carbohydrate?
Yeah, it's funny because our muscles can only store, that's kind of the limiter. Our muscle glycogen has roughly, 300 to 400 grams of storage of carbohydrate. We just cannot saturate that anymore. We do store a little bit in the liver, and there's some carbohydrate fluctuating in the blood. But from a fat storage, there's so many places that we store fat. So obviously, as most people know, that subcutaneous is usually the fat that we can see. We pinch that, but there's a lot of areas in our body, our brain, in between our organs that obviously we can't see, intramuscular. So we actually store fat intramuscularly. So there's so many opportunities and locations we store fat. That we can, and we'll always store fat. Like even the leanest of the lean, like if you look at these marathoners out there, these elite marathoners, they're still going to store about 30,000 or so calories of fat. So you can't see it, like not a lot of it's subcutaneous, but the locations that are storing are definitely inside the body, and there's much more opportunity to store fat. And that's kind of the dichotomy that we see here is it's so much easier to store fat.
Wow.
Yeah.
How did we get this all wrong? How did we miss this?
Well, I'll tell you exactly how we missed it. And this is what led me to really look at the nutrition component of this. As a dietitian, I was always intrigued with that but then as a physiologist, I was in the early 2000s. I'm like, where did this come from? So it actually came from another physiological concept called the crossover concept. And the crossover concept, I believe it was first developed, it was either the 1950s or 1960s. So it was quite a while ago. And that's basically the relationship of fat oxidation or burning, if you will, in relation to carbohydrate oxidation or carbohydrate burning relative to the intensity of exercise. So in a nutshell, we know at rest, our bodies should be burning more fat, but as we increase the intensity of exercise, we know at a certain point, the body needs more carbohydrate. And at that point of the switch over or that crossover, that's the crossover concept. So we know that happens, and we can talk about this later, we don't know where it happens, but what was happening in the 1950s, 1960s with these researchers, they were looking at exercise interventions, basically trying to identify at what exercise intensity, and that could be described from a VO2 max or VO2 peak standpoint or a max heart rate standpoint, they were trying to answer the question, where does this crossover happen? So they studied a whole bunch of different types of exercise, aerobic, anaerobic, you name it, right? And what they came up with was between 63 to 65% of max intensity. That is where your body crosses from using more fat to using more carbohydrate. Now, that, and this is what really intrigued me, because I was looking through the research. I'm like, well, where's the nutrition? Because we know from a biochemistry standpoint that if you start feeding your body a lot of carbs, you're going to be burning a lot of carbs. That's just basic biochemistry 101, right? So I'm looking through this research, like, where's the nutrition? Where's their diet? Like, what are they doing? Nothing existed.
Wow.
So that's where I came in, look, 40, 50 years later. And I said, well, what if we manipulate and basically periodize carbs, protein, and fat? And this was kind of my question was, if I do this, would it actually affect substrate oxidation to the point that I could manipulate this crossover, right? And obviously the answer is yes, because there are such profound changes that we can have in changing someone's daily nutrition. And I'll be the first to say this. When I work with athletes in training their metabolic efficiency, I actually don't do anything with their training, Casey. All I say is keep training the way you normally do, because here's the really big thing. Developing better metabolic efficiency, right? Or developing the body's ability to burn more fat and preserve carbohydrate. It is 25, roughly speaking, these are not exact numbers. Roughly speaking, it is 25% dependent on aerobic exercise and 75% dependent on nutrition changes. So wow. I'm not going to say I don't care about exercise, but when I work with athletes specifically, I do not interrupt their training at all. They could be in a super high intensity training cycle, and I don't pick that apart. I just focus on nutrition.
Wow. What changes do you commonly make with your athletes?
Yeah, in terms of their nutrition?
Yes.
Yeah, I think the biggest mistake, and you and I were both there. Remember the budding endurance athletes, me a little bit before you were, because our age difference, but it was the biggest problems that continue to present themselves to me in my practice here in Colorado are athletes not knowing how to actually periodize or basically undulate and go, increase or decrease their carb, protein, and fat relative to their training status. So, if it's wintertime and we're hibernating, getting ready for hibernation, basically we need to change or periodize our substrates, our macronutrients. So that's my first change. Every 9.99 times out of 10, I always look at carbs, protein, and fat, because it almost always comes into this. I have to lower carb, I have to get protein to where it should be, and then I have to raise fat a little bit. That's like 99% of the time. It almost always happens, because a lot of individuals, athletes or non-athletes, right? It doesn't matter if someone's a high level competitive athlete, they just don't know really how to structure their nutrition. And hopefully I'm not the first one that your listeners here say this, but your nutrition needs to change. It's not like we should actually eat the same thing not in terms of food, but in terms of quantities of these macronutrients. Like, this absolutely needs to change, not only from an exercise perspective, but also from a health perspective. So those are my initial goals for individuals.
So that's one thing that just absolutely blew me away. Like, I knew how to periodize a training program. I knew that there was a race season. I knew there was an off season. I knew there was a preseason. And like if you're playing basketball or something, you might be able to perform at the same level every single day. You definitely have an off season as well, but your performance is kind of the same, and you recover and you can go out in 2 days and do that. With endurance athletes, not like that. You have an A race, a B race, a C race. You train for a specific event at a specific time. And I knew how to periodize the exercise programs, but when I saw the screen that you had 4 different plates that corresponded with off season, preseason, peak performance, and then deload, and it had different kind of about this many of this macronutrient, this much of this macronutrient, here's how you can add in sports products at this specific time, that blew me away.
Yeah, and those are my periodization plates. So prior to, the kind of backstory is here, like prior to me developing this metabolic efficiency training concept, I actually developed the nutrition periodization concept. So just like you, right, as a coach, like this is back in the late 90s, like I started coaching endurance athletes. What we know is that, yeah, we go through these different cycles, but, a lot of athletes were not really knowing how to periodize their nutrition. But from a coaching perspective, and even as a strength coach, right, we know what periodization means. And whether athletes know it or not, they're still doing it, right? So I actually developed nutrition periodization, which is exactly what you're talking about, only because I wanted coaches, athletes, and practitioners to actually be talking like the same language for once. So instead of saying, because basically I was in my practice asking athletes, well, what training cycle are you in? And they would say, well, why does that matter? And it just blew me away, Casey. I'm like, really? You don't change your nutrition based on your training cycle? Like, that started the whole thing. So yeah, what preceded metabolic efficiency training was nutrition periodization. But here's the beauty of it. We combine both of them, and it works for, like, we can periodize and make anybody more metabolically efficient, irrespective. Like, I've worked with so many teams and so many athletes. I don't only specialize in endurance athletes, although that's where I started, and that's kind of my thing, because I am an endurance athlete. But this can be used on, weightlifters, on gymnasts, on swimmers, on football players. And because the whole concept is we should be changing the macronutrient structure based on training cycle, but also based on health goals.
Yeah. It seems so obvious now.
It does, doesn't it?
So obvious. We would do the metabolic test, and for the listener, metabolic test, you come into a gym, we hook you up to a mask where you're breathing in and out, and there's a cable, kind of tube that comes out and it attaches to an analyzer that will tell you how much air is coming in and out and how much oxygen and carbon dioxide is being exchanged in the body. So that tells us exactly how many calories you're burning at different heart rates, and it tells us exactly what percentage of fat versus carbohydrate you are using to fuel that particular intensity of exercise. And we would do those tests, and I would say, okay, you're a fat burner or you're a sugar burner, and see ya. That's it. We never really thought that you could manipulate this or make this better. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, and that's the power of testing, right? I know you and I are on the same board with that. It's like, listen, if you can test, and I know there are some challenges there, which obviously, you can't go anywhere to have this test done, right? You have to have a metabolic card, obviously, but it's actually a lot more practical these days, because I see people in institutions, even just like I've seen metabolic cards like in running stores before, right? You're like, wow, you guys have one? But it's a lot easier to get the testing done so you can actually quantify. And this is what I love about it, is you quantify if the nutrition plan that you're following. Now, I say that because I normally try to stay away from the 4-letter word diet, because I really just hate that word. So you can quantify if the nutrition plan you're following is actually working, not only for your physiology, but also for your genetics, because there's actually a small genetic component that we know now that actually affects the way we process and metabolize fat, protein, and carbohydrates. So that is why we're trying to promote this testing. And there's also a health component of that too. It's not just all about, getting test done to one, see if you're a sugar burner or fat burner, but two, just to influence your exercise. Like, we're also talking about a lot of health parameters, such as, body fat and, hemoglobin, blood glucose, blood insulin. Like, a lot of these things are dependent really on blood sugar control.
I love that. I so much agree. I'm really glad that you brought up the point that you work not only with endurance athletes, but also other athletes. And again, even just normal people with health issues, and how much benefit they can have by learning how to burn fat. I mean, we have extra fat. Most people don't like it. They want it gone and out.
Right.
Why not teach your body to use it? That's great.
And I would even argue, and this would be a stretch, but I probably could make the argument, this is even more important to someone who doesn't really exercise that much, because now there's a huge health component there. Like, we know with ourselves, we exercise a lot, our athletes, whatever, like from an exercise perspective, more so cardiopulmonary, we know their fitness level is decent, right? But for someone who doesn't exercise that much, this becomes so much more important to influence positive health markers.
Yeah, I completely agree. If we're talking about carbohydrate as a storage, we can store a very, very limited amount. I make the direct comparison. Think about parking spaces. If you eat something that has a lot of sugar, that's like a lot of cars getting onto the freeway all at once. Insulin is the signal that says, okay, too many cars, get off and go find your parking spaces. and the cars go and park. And if they don't have parking spaces because they're all full, your body will have to make new parking structures.
Yeah.
So
I love that.
So if I'm working out, I'm using the carbohydrate energy, just like cars leaving those parking spaces. So now there is more space for more cars.
Yes.
So I can have some carbohydrates. But I love that point. Like if you're not exercising, more than likely those spaces are full. And if you are eating a high carbohydrate diet, you will have to build more structures and convert the sugar cars into fat cars or whatever.
Yeah. That's a great analogy. I love that. And it's just so realistic. Like you get it. You're like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. Right. Absolutely. And, I will say that, I do want to make this point because a lot of people hear me and they don't really listen. Right. So they think, all I'm promoting is like a low carb, high fat lifestyle 100% of the time. And they're like carbohydrates are not bad. Right. I mean, fruits and vegetables and even some like true whole grains. But the key is that we as a society, at least, the United States, Americans, we don't know how to periodize those, right? Number one, we don't know how to make the right choices. But number two, we don't know how to increase and decrease and at what times. Because, for the high level competitive athlete, there will be times where they're going to need to consume carbohydrates or a little bit more. And then there's going to be times where they should actually back off quite a bit. I mean, so I do want to make that point. But for the average person who may not be exercising a lot, certainly following even a moderate carbohydrate, nutrition plan, that's probably not going to be advantageous for health or fitness gains.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's a great point. We're not out to say that, carbohydrates are evil, they're bad, you should never have them in every situation ever. It's just that most people are eating way too many most of the time, and they could benefit from getting some of them out. Wow.
Absolutely.
Super interesting.
That's why my focus is always on protein first. Everyone's like, oh, so you like a high protein diet? I'm like, no, I just know you're probably deficient in protein. So that's where we're going to start.
Yeah, that's a great point. I love that. And that's not an energy source. There's a lot of nutritional theories that say you will continue consuming calories in the form of fat or carbohydrates until you get to the protein that you need.
Yes.
So I love that approach. I agree 100%.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Do you approach diet differently between men and women?
I do. Well, yes. Recently, even more so because, and we know this from the research, I've been doing this for a couple of decades now. And, as research comes in and through kind of the pipeline here, we're getting excited about specifically females and specifically around their menstrual cycle. But yes, I am more and more really trying to identify the differences between gender in terms of their physiology and how that can spill over to nutrition. The hard part right now is we know there are differences. We don't know exactly how to address all of those differences because the research simply does not give us many answers just yet because it's still in its infancy. And I'm talking specifically like females and their menstrual cycle, how exercise and physiology is different, how nutrition, biochemistry is different. But certainly, like I've started that in the past couple of years, really trying to identify more with my females and having them track their menstrual cycle, have them get some hormone testing depending on their age. But I think, bottom line, we do need to approach the gender very differently. And even I would even say not from a physiological perspective only, but also psychological perspective, because we know different, and I'm not even going to say personalities, but there are different psychological differences between, male and female that we need to account for in counseling individuals.
That's a really great point. Do you think cycling works better for women than it does for men, especially inside like a 28-day period?
Cycling in terms of
carbohydrate intake.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Oh my gosh. And we just know because of either low or high menstrual or high hormone phases with estrogen and progesterone, we know, I would even say the carbohydrate cycling is a necessity. It's not even important. It's like absolute necessity. The hard part is we just like, there's not an answer. This is what still kind of frustrates me. There's not an answer to say, oh yes, on this part of your cycle, you need to do X, Y, Z. We've got some guidelines, and unfortunately, we just have to individualize it. Like I've spent the past couple months working with a young female athlete, and literally just having her track her cycle. And we've been experimenting on where we need to actually cycle the carbohydrate, and then obviously protein and fat, just to see what works for her body. So long-winded answer to your question, but yes, we absolutely need to account for that and make that a little bit more apparent and important in a female's nutrition plan.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's super frustrating when coaching somebody, we want to have all the answers. We're all A-types, especially an endurance athlete. Yeah. Frustrating to not have the answer, but that is the answer. You got to guess and check and play with it for yourself, see how you feel.
Yeah. I think the good news on that front is that the more exposure that we give this, and specifically even something simple as asking a female athlete or individual just to track their menstrual cycle, to track their flow, to track their PMS symptoms, that in itself is a huge win on the board. I mean, it absolutely is. So if we can start there, then we can actually start diving a little bit deeper into making recommendations for nutrition and even exercise.
Great advice. You wrote the book, Metabolic Efficiency Training. When did you write that?
Oh boy, I think the first edition came out in, I believe it was 2009. So my nutrition periodization book came out in 2008, I believe. Yeah, I think Metabolic Efficiency was 2009, second edition in 2014. Starting to work on the third edition right now because there's more to add. So
cool.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
I know.
Okay, so 2009. So you had been at, your conclusion for 5, 6, 7 years. What did you change between the first book and the second book?
Yeah, well, initially, I developed metabolic efficiency training, this concept to try to get rid of GI distress, and again, biasly, I told you my story, how I would have GI distress on longer training days, Ironman races, other athletes would also. So I developed it just to get rid of GI distress. So that was the big focal point on the first edition was GI distress, reduce calories per hour because we can actually use fat as energy. And that was pretty much it in the first edition. The second edition came along, and I had another, 4 or 5 years of practice. And then I started actually getting more data from my athletes. So not only was I doing more testing, but these athletes were coming at me with more blood work testing, blood lipid panels. And I was actually, fasting blood glucose. And I was seeing some things. I'm like, oh, wait a second. So based on how I'm periodizing their nutrition to become more metabolically efficient, now we're seeing more health positive results, right? So that actually led me to the second edition in really putting not only a little bit more emphasis on health and kind of vitality, if you will, but health concerns and health challenges and the influence of really, blood sugar regulation. But also I had more data from my metabolic efficiency testing to share on different types of athletes. So I had not only the endurance athlete anymore, but I had fitness enthusiasts. I had, the couch to 5Kers. I had CrossFit athletes. So I wanted to share that because while data is data, which can seem kind of similar, the interventions are very different. And that's what I was excited to share from first edition to second edition.
I love that. Just had a bigger sample size, basically.
Exactly. Exactly.
So what have you learned since without, giving away your third edition book?
Yeah.
What have you learned since? What things are going to be a little different in that one?
There's definitely more of an emphasis, as we were just talking about, on female physiology and the menstrual cycle. And there is definitely a piece of the puzzle that I've been learning more about relative to metabolic efficiency. So that will be definitely part of the new edition. What I'm also starting to do is I'm trying to bring metabolic efficiency more into team sports. So I'm trying to help coaches and practitioners who work with team sport athletes and even those athletes. I'm trying to help them realize that, because as you know, I think a lot of people relegate metabolic efficiency to endurance athletes, right? Because it was born by an endurance athlete, by a sport dietitian who works with endurance athletes. So I've actually used and started using it in team sport athletes a little bit more. And I don't have as much of a client base there. It's much, much easier here in Colorado, as you know, to get endurance athletes. But what I'm doing is I'm expanding the knowledge into why this might be kind of a missing link for a more anaerobic based athlete. So that's going to be an exciting component also. And I'm learning a little bit more about that.
That's super interesting. Can you give me an example of like what sport specifically that's really highly anaerobic that you're going to focus on?
Yeah, well, Yeah. So right now, I actually have the pleasure of working with a collegiate gymnastics team, female gymnastics team. So everything I just said is very pertinent to that. But they are very much anaerobic. Like I don't even know if you can count how many seconds are aerobic. I mean, obviously, the energy systems intertwine, but you're talking 10 seconds for a vault up to maybe 90 seconds to be for a beam routine or a floor routine.
Wow.
So very, very anaerobic. So things like that, wrestling, very, very anaerobic component there. So I'm trying to kind of branch out of my comfort zone, which has been, swimming, biking, and running, and, like ultra stuff. And I'm trying to bring it back to the wow, your energy. So you're basically competing for 30 seconds. Okay, let's look at the metabolic demands and the changes that you need here.
Wow, that's super interesting.
Yeah.
What you've kind of alluded to? No, go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, you came to these conclusions with a lot more ease, where I came to these conclusions kicking and screaming, and I still don't know about a third of what you know. So,
right.
You've alluded to this earlier in the conversation, but what recommendations would you generally give to an athlete versus somebody who's just kind of the average American?
Yeah, my philosophy is always, with an athlete, it's looking at nutrition periodization. Like, what training cycle are you in? What are your physiological demands and adaptations that you're trying to go through right now? Because they are very different than just the average person, going out just to exercise, right? They're like those individuals are going to exercise to, stress reduction, mental health, maybe trying to lose a little bit of weight. But athletes just require a little bit more planning and preparing, because they go through different training modes and activities that require really more quantitative analysis, if you will. So I like to start with athletes more on the nutrition periodization. But then the second step that is actually similar to both is I really focus on how do we optimize blood sugar through changing carbohydrate, protein, and fat. So the change process is way different between fitness enthusiast versus athlete, but it's still coming back home to trying to optimize blood sugar in the best way by periodizing carbohydrate, protein, and fat. It has to be, that balance is more delicate with an athlete, because as you know, we want to support a couple hours of training perhaps, whereas an individual who's out for fitness, maybe they're just doing an activity under an hour, where we don't really need to have that as a high priority, but we do need to focus on their daily life a little bit more, because that is basically their training, if you will.
Yeah, so it's just a little bit more basic, more simple, and needs to be periodized less.
Exactly.
Wow. Exactly. Gotcha. You mentioned measuring blood sugar. Is there a particular way you like to do that?
I think the only really good way, and I hate to say it, but is, get a blood sugar meter and, stick your finger, just like a blood ketone meter. I think that's going to give you the best. Within financial reason, if someone can get a continuous glucose monitor, that'd be great. But those are hundreds of dollars, if you get insurance to cover it, but I doubt they would if a person's not diabetic. But I think honestly, every individual should have, I don't even know how much they cost these days. They're so inexpensive, right? I think everybody should have a blood glucose meter, irrespective of what you're trying to do, because if you understand your body better, like if you wake up tomorrow morning and take your blood sugar and it's over 100, you should start questioning that, and then take it the next morning. Like, I have actually helped individuals by basically saying this, Casey, hey, go buy a blood sugar unit, measure it a couple times, let me know what your values are. We've actually kind of headed off diabetes at the pass, if you will, or pre-diabetes, because we found something abnormal in their resting, and we would only be able to do that if they had that blood sugar meter, right? So I think, a message for the listeners is go spend, $50, $70, whatever they are these days, get a blood sugar meter, and, a couple times a week, stick your finger and get that data, because gosh, the more you can understand your body, the better you can feed it, and the better you can really, really prescribe exercise.
Yeah, I love that. We just had Dr. Mark Cucuzella on. He's a doctor out of West Virginia. He wrote the book, Run for Your Life. And he has found an inexpensive continuous blood glucose monitor. So I'm going to have to reach out to him to see what brand he uses, because I want to say he had a CGM that was somewhere in the $50, $60 range. So that would be helpful.
phenomenal. I mean, I think at that range, I think almost everyone should have one.
Yeah, they are so fascinating. We also had the filmmaker who made the film Fat Fiction. I don't know if you saw that movie.
Oh yeah, I did see that. Yeah, yeah.
Do you remember the experiment they did? Where they took three people, gave them CGMs, fed them a lower carb, kind of higher fat diet, and they were like really full and had good energy. And then they had to go and do that for a week. And then for the next week, they did a low fat, high carb diet. And you just felt so bad for these people because you knew exactly what was going to happen. Starving, lethargic, I'm grumpy. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. And the difference in blood sugar, you're right, is incredible. Like the CGM on a lower carbohydrate diet was like a little bit more steady. It flowed a little. But when you're on a low fat, high carb diet, man, the peaks and valleys and peaks and valleys, just insane.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, and here's a good, I'd love to get that information, but here's a really good thing to think about too. And for people listening is numbers don't lie, right? You and I know this. We do the test. We've done the testing, right? We know numbers don't lie, but here's the thing that I've realized with people is, if they kind of cycle, like if someone did that experiment, but without a CGM, if you were just ask them, how do you feel? A lot of times they would just say, well, I did feel different. I just felt a little different on the higher carb, lower fat. Whereas, if you have those quantifiable numbers saying, yeah, your blood sugar was actually 20 points higher or whatever it is, right? That actually validates, and this is why I love using testing, it validates that is not the nutrition plan for you, right? So sometimes people need numbers to actually make change.
I totally agree. That's such a good point. Yeah. Well, this has been awesome. Let's take a quick break, and then I want to bring you back and ask you a few more questions. So a few years ago, a buddy of mine had this idea, and he told me the idea, and he said, I am going to start at one rim of the Grand Canyon. I'm going to run to the other rim. And I said, that's the stupidest idea I've ever heard. And he's like, whoa, I'm not done. I'm going to run to one rim, and then I'm going to turn around and run back to the other rim, rim to rim to rim. And I said, you are out of your mind. Absolutely out of your mind. And you have done the same thing.
I actually have, yeah.
That is nuts.
I do those things. Yeah, this was actually almost 2 years ago to the date. It was 2018 on Halloween. I actually remember this vividly because, we obviously still had competitions, and I had just that summer in August, I had done my first ever, you've heard of Spartan races before, right?
Yeah,
I've done all the distances, but that year up in Breckenridge, they had a Spartan Ultra. So it was a 31 mile, Spartan. And we had to go up and down the ski mountain twice. Right. And I was like, yeah, I'll do, like, I was loving it. Like, I love that kind of training. So I actually had a little bit of fitness after that. And this was late August. And I'm like, and I don't know where I heard this rim, or I have no idea where it came up, but I'm all like, I'm all for challenges. And I'm like, that sounds like kind of up my alley. That sounds kind of cool. Like, you're in one of the 7 wonders of the world, you're exercising, and so I just decided, I said, okay, I'll go on Halloween. Why not? Like, I was doing research and like when the water shuts off, all this stuff, but I literally drove down the day before Halloween. I camped in one of the campgrounds. I woke up, 3:00 in the morning, although I had really restless sleep, and headed out and, packed all my stuff and went from one rim to the other rim. And, 13 and a half hours later, I'm in my car driving home again.
You said you enjoy challenges. Like you said, I enjoy challenges. Like you enjoy binge watching The Mandalorian over the weekend or something. Like, how long is that?
That would be a challenge.
It's like 48 miles, isn't it?
Yeah, it depends on the route. The route that I chose was I think it was 40. It was either 46 or 40. I think it was the 48 one. There's 2 trails you can take from the South Rim. There's either Bright Angel or I think it's South Kabab. I took the Bright Angel one that's a little bit longer.
Wow. Is there a single foot of that trail that is flat?
There is actually. When you get down to the bottom, once you cross the Colorado River, it is actually right by Phantom Ranch. There is probably, maybe a total of a half a mile or so that's absolutely flat.
That must be an enjoyable half mile.
Oh, when I was coming back, I was like, oh, please, I just want flat. Like, I don't want downhill. I don't want uphill. But you see it like when you come back too, you're crossing the suspension bridge in the Colorado River and you look up and you just see what you have to go back up. And
Oh
you're like,
man.
oh my gosh, 5,000, 6,000 feet. And you're like,
Oh.
okay, here we go.
And it's just a wall, right? Like straight up.
It is. It is like it actually, that's what fascinated me. Like the South Rim, the trails are much better taken care of. And you can really tell like that's where all the tourists go. The North Rim, like there are some sketchy parts of that trail. Like there were parts where I'm like, man, if I take a step, like I'm down this cliff right now. So it's a wonder. Every time I was going up the North Rim, I'm like, I can't imagine who actually carved these trails, like power to them, but that would be a little freaky.
Wow. Yeah, no thanks. You won't catch me there anytime soon.
I know.
Wow, that's crazy. Well, congratulations on that. That's quite an accomplishment.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about your company.
Well, yeah. So I have a couple of them. True to my nature, I just can't, stand still and do one thing. That's probably why I do these crazy adventures. But my first one is eNRG Performance, and that's basically my nutrition coaching, my physiological and biomarker testing, and then my endurance coaching company. So kind of everything in one. And I'm based out of Colorado, as you mentioned, right outside of Denver in Littleton, and have a facility where I do a lot of the physiological testing, specifically metabolic efficiency. But I've got a couple of sport dietitians. I've got a couple coaches that work with me, and we work with anyone from fitness enthusiasts just wanting to get their health in check and better fitness, all the way up to professional Olympic level athletes. So I've been doing that since I don't even know when. I'm going on 2 decades, like I said earlier. So I've always had my independent business. And since 2017, I started another business called Birota Foods. And with another sport dietitian that I kind of sought out, I had this idea for Birota Foods. And incidentally, because I always had people saying, "Oh, you've got all these ideas for why don't you just develop a sport drink or an energy bar?" And this was 5-10 years ago. I'm like, "Are you crazy? Like, why would I do that? Like, I'm a practitioner, a sport dietitian, I'm a coach. Come on, that's like a waste of my time. Why would I?" And at that point too, I'm like, "There's so much on the market. Like, how could I even compete with a Cliff Bar or whatever, right?" So of course, here I am sitting. Not that we're competing with them, but it was funny because I never thought I would actually vision myself with a food company. And this is kind of a funny story and kind of the backstory, but I remember this so vividly. It was 2015. And I was riding my bike. It was outside. I was riding my road bike. It was February here in Colorado. And, we can get really lucky in the wintertime. So we could be outside and, it's sunny and, it's maybe 40 degrees and it's night, like you dress for it. So I was riding and, the weather turned bad and I kind of got caught in it. Even though I was prepared clothing wise, I was still freezing my butt off. The only thing I could think about was, how do I get warm? So I'm like, okay, I can sprint home, but that's like an hour ride. And then, of course, we fantasize, right? I started fantasizing about food, about warm stuff. And I started fantasizing with a drink that I grew up with here in the mountains, hot cocoa, right? Hot chocolate. And I'm like, oh, wouldn't just a nice cup of hot cocoa be so nice? And then I was thinking, and this is what happens when I train, my mind just wanders, right? And I was thinking, well, let's see, I'm going to go home and I'm just going to devour hot cocoa. But I'm thinking, well, I don't want all that sugar. And maybe there's a way to make it functional. So that was actually the birth of Birota Foods, was me saying, I can make a cocoa that's more functional without sugar than anybody out there. Right? And it just doesn't exist, right? Nobody's doing that. So I destroyed my kitchen. I tried to make a prototype, which tasted horrible. And I kind of tabled the idea, to be honest with you. I'm like, oh, okay, it's, just kind of nitpick here and there. And then the next year I was presenting at this nutrigenomics, a small little conference workshop here up in Boulder. And I met this gal who is a sport dietitian, but she's also a food scientist and she's also a chef. So she's culinary trained. And I think I was eating lunch with her. I'm like, hey, I've got this idea. And she really grasped the idea. And I'm like, hey, but here's my problem. I don't know how to make it taste good. So can you help me? And she's like, oh yeah, absolutely. So that was kind of the birth of Birota Foods. And
Wow.
it was, literally it was born on a bike. It really was on
That's
that,
so
that
awesome.
cold day in 2015. Yeah. So now in addition to all my nutrition coaching, now I'm, co-owner of this food company that produces, we call it smart cocoa because one of our flagship ingredients is caprylic acid, which, as you know, it improves ketone
Hmm.
levels, the body's ability to burn fat. It also helps cognitive functioning. And it's like I developed it based on my metabolic efficiency training concept because I knew I needed it to optimize blood sugar and I didn't want any crap in it either. So, we make a cocoa, we make a creamer. We're starting to take on the oatmeal market. So we have what we call the smart note meal. So it's not oatmeal, it's the anti-oatmeal. But all of our products have caprylic acid and D-ribose. So D-ribose is a 5 carbon carbohydrate that actually it reacts very differently in the body than a 6 carbon carbohydrate like glucose. So a 5 carbon like D-ribose actually stabilizes and sometimes actually reduces blood sugar. So we've got very functional ingredients, and I'm sure you can tell by my voice pitches, but I get so excited about like the ability to create food based on my metabolic efficiency concept. Like it's awesome.
That's great. I mean, that's so
Yeah,
valuable to be able to
it
offer
is.
products that relate to everything you know and everything you teach. That's amazing. What's
Exactly.
your favorite product
Oh, of those products.
of any product you sell?
Oh, it's I am a cocoa guy. Like I said, I grew up in the mountains in Colorado with cocoa, like sugar cocoa and marshmallows. So I love our smart cocoa. Having said that, I eat our smart note meal every single morning. Whether it's like we have 4 different flavors, so I mound through that like crazy because it is like total blood sugar stabilizing. But if you were to back me in a quarter, and it's definitely the smart cocoa.
Good answer.
Yeah.
You've told us about the book. Is there anything else you're
Yeah.
working on for the future?
The third edition, as I told you, I actually have just literally within the last week just launched another food line, which again, I never planned on doing this. It was just out of necessity. So I actually launched gourmet snack mix. So this is actually a snack mix that has ingredients that are not only functional and no preservatives and basically no crap in there, but actually stabilize your blood sugar. And here's how it came along. I am fortunate to be the sport dietitian I mentioned earlier for the University of Denver women's gymnastics team. And this is my second year with them. And the biggest issue that they have had, and the biggest issue thus I have had, is finding snacks that actually support a high performing student athlete. And I mean, in the classroom and out of the classroom. So, it's crackers, it's chips, it's all these things. And I'm like, I basically, Casey, I just got sick of trying to find something out there. So I went back to the kitchen and I'm like, I can do this better. I've got a very different snack mix. So I've got kind of this special ingredient that is actually a whey protein based crisp. So it's like a little puff that is all whey protein. And I put that in with a few nuts and some other ingredients that depending on the flavor. But what I've developed is the snack mix that actually is a complete protein, number one, and is actually high in leucine. And as you know, and as your listeners are going to find out, leucine is the amino acid that single-handedly is responsible for activating protein synthesis.
So important.
So
So important.
as you know, right? And it's got a super high omega-3. So my snack mix also has great antioxidants, but super high omega-3 content too for the anti-inflammatory. So that's my newest thing that I'm working on. And like I said, I just went to market last week and introducing another flavor, hopefully next week. So I started with a dark chocolate tart cherry flavor, and now I'm working on a savory flavor.
Oh man, that sounds really good. Do
Yeah,
you
yeah.
mind? Do you mind time traveling back about 20 years? My main meals in college were, I think, mostly ramen, and my snacks were peanut butter jelly
Yes.
sandwiches. And it was weird.
Yes,
I could
me
hardly
too.
focus. It was bizarre. Like couldn't.
I know. Well, I know, and I'm right with you. Like that was it, right? And I talked to my gymnasts because I supply them with this, And I get their feedback. They're like, this is amazing. Like they're not only able to focus and concentrate better because they're actually stabilizing their blood sugar, right? But they said, hey, guess what? It actually tastes good. And I'm like, yes.
That's great. Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
That sounds great. Is there anything else that you're really passionate about these days? We can tell your passion just comes right through the speakers. I love it. Is there anything else you want to mention, talk about?
Well, you kind of hit on it when you were introing us. So and I'm continuing to work on this too, but I am so passionate on educating people, and not only the athletes I work with. Don't get me wrong. I love the individuals and the athletes I work with and the teams, but I just, and not even as of lately, probably the past 10, 12 years, I have kind of expanded into trying to teach and kind of to get on the page of more health professionals and coaching and fitness and nutrition professionals. So I've really been trying to work on, my mentorship programs. I have a metabolic efficiency training specialist certification that I take health professionals through and mentor them through. So that's kind of something that I'm starting to gravitate more towards, is trying to influence more of the influencers, if you will.
That's great.
Yeah.
Man, this has been such a fun conversation. I wish more people throw out the science. Don't even look at the science. Just go find people who you want to be like. They're passionate, they're excited, they have tons of energy, they are giving, they share. They're the most kind and compassionate people, and then just see what they do. See if you can find some patterns, and I would be willing to bet that you would. It's so awesome to talk to you and people in this world, and just get that sense of just passion and energy, and it's really infectious. It's really great.
Oh, thank you. Well, and there's a lot of us out there, like you said. We just have to find each other.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah.
We've got some final questions for you. These are the questions we ask all of our listeners. The first one is, what is one thing you've learned or changed your mind about this last week?
Oh, well, I am a continual learner. So I either read books, listen to podcasts, obviously, anything that I can just absorb, I just absorb like a sponge. So one of the things I actually learned this week, and I knew about it, but I didn't actually know it, was actually related to what's called the solar zenith angle. And I don't know if you've ever heard about this, but it was actually a podcast I was listening to about vitamin D, right? And based on, and we always say this, like in Colorado, we've got 300 days of sunshine, and we know sunshine helps our bodies produce vitamin D. But I just learned, based on the solar zenith angle, which is basically how high the sun sits in the sky, in the wintertime, it has a low angle. So the solar zenith angle is low. Therefore, even if you go outside a lot and without sunscreen, and you have some bare skin, you're still not going to be able to absorb a lot and make a lot of vitamin D because of that angle. Yeah. Yep, the first thing I ever heard, I was like, oh yeah, that's interesting. Okay. Yeah. So that was something I learned.
That's great. I love that. We had Nadine Artemis on our show a few weeks ago, and I heard her content several years ago, and she introduced me to an app called D-Minder, and it can help you track your vitamin D exposure based on where you are on the planet and where the sun's angles are, how long you're out there, skin type, percentage of your skin exposed, all that kind of stuff. It's great.
That is awesome.
It's always depressing. There's a day in November when it says next vitamin D available 3 months. You're just like, no.
Oh, God. Oh, no. I know.
What's the name of that podcast that you referenced?
It is actually We Do Science by Laurent Bannock. He's out of the UK. He's a brilliant guy. He's a good friend of mine. Awesome. He actually does a lot, with the ISSN and stuff. He's a great podcast. It's all science based, right? And that's kind of the geek in me. Yeah,
that's great. Yeah, we'll link to that in the show notes. We love those.
Yeah.
Question number 2: what is one thing you'd wish you had done better this week?
Oh, better. I would say, I like to read every day. I wish so I like to separate my reading into professional and personal. I like to read books that I have nothing to really do with my profession sometimes, right? So I think what I can do better, and I try this every week, is I want to try to allocate more time for my personal reading instead of my professional reading.
Gotcha.
And I'm doing it more and more, but yeah, like right now I'm just finishing a book called Shoe Dog, and it's actually about Phil Knight, the founder of Nike, and his progression into actually finding, founding the company, and just his progression. Like, it's a fascinating book, fascinating story.
Wow. Yeah, that's super interesting, huh? Cool. This last week, I just randomly dialed up a bunch of podcasts that had topics that I had nothing to do with and knew nothing about. And it's interesting to get really focused on one subject, but it's also interesting to stay broad and learn about things that you wouldn't normally learn about in your profession.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Question number 3, what is one thing you are very proud of this week?
Oh, I think that would be related to my training, my physical training. So I like to carve out at least an hour a day. Sometimes it doesn't happen. Sometimes it does. This week, I've been very, very good at it, like actually scheduling it and making sure it gets done. So far, it is later in the week, and so far I'm batting 1,000. So
nice.
Very proud of that.
Congratulations. That's awesome.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, you survived the 3 questions. What is one simple takeaway from this conversation that you'd want people to plug and play into their life?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is remember this, and we didn't talk about it too much, but changing your nutrition is actually a behavior change. So don't get upset with yourself. This is a journey. Like, it takes a little while to change a behavior and therefore adapt a new nutrition plan to fit your lifestyle instead of just adopting a diet mentality. Go in it for the long haul. Like, it's like buying a stock and, you just want to let it sit for a while, but just be patient with yourself and know that nutrition changes will happen. Sometimes they do take a little bit of time though.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Just stick with it.
Yeah, exactly.
Bob, this is an honor to talk to you and to learn from you today. I mean that. It's influenced my life and my career and the people I see and the people we work with in many, many, many different ways. So really legitimately from the bottom of my heart, thank you for your work and for what you do.
You are welcome. You're too kind. I definitely appreciate that. But influencing influencers, right? It's what I love to do. Yeah.
That's what we got to do. Where can people go to find you?
Oh yeah, they can go pretty much anywhere. I am on all social media that you can imagine. You can definitely like Google me would be easy, although my last name is sometimes hard to spell. But if you go to my primary website, eNRG, eNRG performance.com, or Birota Foods, BIROTA foods.com, super easy to get a hold of me.
Awesome. That's great. We'll make sure we link to both of those in the show notes.
Oh, thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for appearing. We're really grateful for you and your time.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for putting this on and inviting me.
Absolutely. We'll definitely be inviting you back when your book comes out if you would like to appear again.
I would love to.
Love to. Well, that's great. Well, thanks for your time today.
All right. Thank you, Casey.
All right. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.